Hello everyone, and welcome to an Age of Empires 3 campaign review. The focus of this video will be on the first half of the Native American 2-act story. Normally, this is the part where I would provide a recap of the previous stories, but this is the first review where I don't need to do that. Nor do you have to watch the previous videos. There are a few moments in this story which require a bit of history, but context will be provided as needed. The hope is that, unlike the most recent videos, this one will be able to stand out on its own. Oh, and after all this is done, I'll be making a final video covering all my thoughts about these campaigns. A daunting task, but if there are any inaccuracies that I have provided, mistakes I have made, or anything else that didn't quite make it, I would like to have the opportunity to cover it all. Also, it will make things a bit nicer, since viewers won't have to watch all of my videos to get the big picture. Alright, this intro is too long. Time to get to the story. Our story begins with Nathaniel Black, father of Emilia, the narrator. He grows up in the Iroquois Confederacy, and when the American Revolution starts up, there is some disagreement about who to support, the British or the winning team. Kanyen's desire is to stay out of the fight, while Nathaniel insists that a side will be chosen for them if they don't decide. In the end, Kanyen commands him to follow, as Kanyen attempts to reason with the Seneca and Mohawk tribes to convince them to also stay out of the fight.
Perhaps the reports about the Mohawk and Seneca allying with the British have been exaggerated.
You were saying, Uncle?
Their response is an ambush. Well, so much for diplomacy. Time for the first mission. I'll let the Oneida war chief explain.
The Mohawk lived to the northeast. The Seneca lived to the northwest. Battles between tribes are often decided by a swift show of force. If we destroy one tribe's town center, the other tribe will stop fighting as well.
And a show of force, regardless of how swift it is, will do just fine. This mission wasn't too difficult, but it was a bit of a challenge. As long as the player survives the first few attacks, they'll be just fine. Also, while playing this mission, the Seneca stopped attacking after their first assault for some reason for the rest of the mission. A minor bug, to be sure, but it was a bit odd. One destroyed town center later, Nathaniel returns to a destroyed village. Turns out, the Mohawk raided their village. While he and Kanyen were gone, they took many prisoners, including Nathaniel's mother. And here, we get introduced to the primary antagonist of this story, Kuchler. So far, so good. After all, unlike the attack during John Black's story, this antagonist's involvement makes sense. The Mohawk have allied with the British, and the British employ German mercenaries, making them allies for the duration of the war. Nathaniel's conflict with the Mohawk leads him into conflict with the Hessians, and, subsequently, with the British. I'm surprised this story is a bit more cohesive than the previous one, but it's a pleasant surprise, to be sure. Alright, back to the story. Nathaniel and Kanyen assemble a war party to go after the Mohawk and their Hessian allies. This mission is, actually, quite easy. The mission's special condition prevents villagers from being trained, making the player rely on shipments and freed prisoners. But this did very little to change the difficulty of the mission, mainly because while I was playing, the base wasn't attacked all that much. Every now and then the Hessians sent a scout to my base, only to find there were defenses. They also didn't respond to the fact that they were being shot at, for some reason. This was a bit strange. Oh, also the final army which the Hessians have are mainly stuck in this cave, which is a choke point that can be easily abused. A direct confrontation without these conditions would have been tricky, but not destroying the stable here and leaving the Germans as little space as possible made this a breeze. So far, Kuchler isn't proving himself to be a capable strategist, but compared to other examples in the past, this is an improvement. So far. Once the captives are rescued, Nathaniel makes the decision to join the American Revolution, to do battle with the Hessians, as well as their employers.
Some joined the British, while others helped the colonial cause. My father left his village.
Alright, sorry to interject here, but something's been bothering me for these past few cutscenes.
So the Seneca have joined with the Mohawk.
Yes, both tribes think the British will protect them.
You can listen to them again if you want to try and hear what I'm talking about, but it appears to be an audio balancing issue. It's also happened during missions as well.
Perhaps the reports about the Mohawk and Seneca allying with the British have been exaggerated.
You were saying, Uncle?
Even the music volume and background sounds remain consistent during these jarring moments. I'm not sure how this slipped under the radar, or if Microsoft noticed, but they just don't have time to fix it. Regardless, mistakes like these can weaken immersion. Let's just hope this isn't a pattern. Anyways, let's continue with that cutscene.
What's going on here?
Are you...
Oh no, not again. You know what? Let's just skip the rest of this and go straight to the next mission. You're in Boston now. Normally, there would be worse places to be, but at this point in time, the British are beginning to attack a hill near your area. You have to hold it, or else the mission is over. And this is when the difficulty really spikes. I've mentioned a few times how I've been playing this campaign on the hard difficulty, but I don't think I was quite prepared for this mission. I even lost a handful of times. The attacks after a while just became relentless, back to back. Additionally, while waves upon waves of redcoats swarm the hill, ships are attacking your base, and other troops are attempting to secure 2 of the coastal cannons. Honestly, only one of them is important since it's next to your base, but this was an intense level, and I loved it. The feeling of finally overcoming this was euphoric, and I didn't want to let it go. Unlike the last level, where the enemy didn't attack my base at all, this victory felt earned, and I couldn't wait to see what the next mission held in store for me. Anyways, even when holding this position for so long, eventually Nathaniel and his men have to retreat. Things are looking grim, until our main character meets up with the best character in the game.
General Washington, I'm honored to meet you, sir.
The honor is mine, Captain Black.
That's right, George is back. They meet up to discuss their next attack, which is going to be an ambush on the Hessian winter quarters. A fine plan, one which involves you and your men sneaking past the patrol and destroying tents. Honestly, I'm a bit surprised that the Hessians don't even hear the sounds of the outposts firing on your men, but whatever. After destroying all the tents, the patrol ceases to exist, and the next part of the plan begins. Take it away, George.
We don't have the manpower to take on his main army. Build some fires to trick Cornwallis into thinking we've made camp for the night.
Aha. These fire pits look awfully big for a campfire, and it's happening in a town no less. If Cornwallis looks at the city and sees that much smoke, there's a fairly good chance he'll think there's been some arson afoot, rather than some camping. He investigates with his main army, leaving a small group to guard the rear. After taking out his rear guard, you and your men get control of a small base. Cornwallis's army took control of the town, and is probably wondering what happened to their rear guard that they just stopped hearing from. I had to prepare for incoming attacks. Alright, it's time for another tangent. Difficulty. Measuring difficulty precisely can be a bit difficult, since the real-time strategy genre offers a variety of possible solutions, some easier to execute than others. However, there are some objective means by which difficulty can be measured. The first one that comes to mind is the amount of troops that you have to go up against. If the enemy just doesn't send troops to your base at all, then it's objectively an easier scenario than a mission where the enemy bothers to send troops your way. I don't mind scenarios being easier than others, but what is driving me up the wall is the alternation of difficulty. The first mission was difficult, since I had to juggle military and economic production simultaneously. The second one was easy, since I didn't have to worry about incoming attacks and could simply build up enough troops to snowball through the level. The third mission was brutal, since the enemy targeted both the objective and the main base with a large quantity of troops. And this mission is so easy, it's boring. Just build up troops and snowball through the level. Generally, it's normal for campaigns to have a difficulty that varies between levels. What's abnormal is the fact that this pattern of sudden and drastic changes in difficulty happens for a good portion of this act. In fact, spoiler alert, the next mission is rather difficult, while the one after this is easy with a simple strat. This is quite jarring, and I didn't expect it to play out like this. Let's just get to the next mission.
But the fighting was indecisive until late summer near Saratoga.
There's the British column. They're headed to Albany.
Captain, If they get that far, they'll cut our army in two.
Time to ambush some redcoats. The mission starts with a handful of waves of troops and fort wagons. After a few successful raids, the player is given control of a small economy and the hard part begins. The goal is to build 3 forts before the British build 3 of their own.
When we reach the fortress age, we will be able to train
I'm
fort
ready.
wagons from our town center. It will be expensive,
going now.
but my family's money can help.
We'll revisit this line, but in a good way later on. In addition to occasional attacks, Kuchler will arrive to make things difficult. There is an optional objective which delays Kuchler for a bit, but eventually he'll also show up and join the fray. This was a bit of a challenge, and forced me to keep an army away from the base to intercept fort wagons since, once a fort is up, it's rather difficult to take down. After all, the player won't have access to mortars, and cannons are in the fort's attack range. And that's just if the fort was alone and isn't guarded by a group of troops, which it usually is. It was a good challenge, even if it did get a bit tedious. While this was an impressive victory, the army is in for a rough time with winter quarters. General Washington is concerned about the troops' level of training, but Nathaniel is concerned about basic supplies. In the end, Nathaniel decides to go out and get supplies. But first, basic houses need to be constructed. Then the player will have to gather 3,000 food in order to gain access to a basic economy. A few missions back, I mentioned that the difficulty of this mission becomes much easier with a simple strategy. Well, that's because the developers didn't intend for a few things to happen. Like, for instance, building houses outside of the base location. Every now and then, enemy troops showed up to attack, and this would be a problem, if they had anything to attack. For the most part, I just left the base empty, and the enemy just stuck around, not knowing what to do if there wasn't any troops to fight or buildings to burn. As for food, there are a few different ways to get 3,000 food. One of the ways, for instance, costs money, but there's no need for that. The local natives can help out with the food shortage once a trading post is built. Once that's done, we can get villagers who have a reduced set of abilities. I guess the developers accounted for players who would try and build a base before meeting the food requirement. What they didn't account for is that these workers can gather everything else. That's right, with no enemy attacks to worry about, and no timer for this mission, the player can stock up enough gold to buy an army. And those militia from earlier, they're still able to gather wood. In short, instead of humble beginnings, you can start off right, with a massive base and plenty of resources to boot. Fun fact, the next mission is more broken than this one, but we'll get there in a bit. After surviving the winter, General Washington meets with Nathaniel to discuss strategy, along with something else.
My scouts report Colonel Kuchler's Hessians are moving on our north flank. Intercept him before he cuts our supply line.
Thank you, General.
But Nathaniel, this war, this revolution, it's larger than any one man. I know Kuchler has wronged you personally, but your father's desire for revenge led him to his death.
General Washington, my father gave his life to protect the colonies. I would do the same, without hesitation.
Now this... Alright, I guess it's time to talk about the plot again. The discussion about what Nathaniel's father did and why these two view it completely differently makes sense. In Act 2, John Black, as far as George knows, ran off west after the Circle of Ossus, never to return. However, Kanyan was close enough to John Black that he got to see the whole story. Specifically, the part where John gave his life to stop a Russian invasion, saving the colonies. So the disagreement isn't that big of a deal. Still, there is a problem with this. Why would George bring this up? Is it because he's concerned that Nathaniel will act in a reckless manner for the sake of revenge? That's probably not the answer, since George has seen how Nathaniel deals with Hessian troops. There hasn't been any part of this story which explicitly shows how Nathaniel made tactical blunders while facing off with German mercenaries. He's fought them before, he knows what he's doing. Also, the last time Nathaniel mentions having unfinished business with the Hessians, George is alright with this.
I've got unfinished business with the Hessians.
Good. Let's give them a holiday to remember.
Now, there is another possible interpretation of this, mainly that he's concerned about Nathaniel's safety. The next line helps reinforce this theory.
Your enlistment is up next month. You could go back home to your family.
And out of all the different ways this particular exchange can be viewed, this seems like the most compatible interpretation. Unfortunately, it doesn't have a whole lot of foundation. The only cutscene in this entire series which suggests that this was the case is a remark George Washington gives when Nathaniel says he'll personally go behind enemy lines to get supplies. The first thing to bring up is that personally sneaking around the enemy by yourself is a lot more risky than commanding a handful of troops. The second thing to bring up is that if George wanted to keep Nathaniel safer, he would, send someone else to intercept the Hessians. Overall, a confusing conversation. Let's move on from this. For the next mission, your faction changes from a mostly American-ish militia force back to natives, for some reason. Also, George Washington will be sending artillery your way in order to help support your troops. The main objective is to take out the Hessians. Pretty simple stuff. And normally you're supposed to free this guy, and he'll give a speech about how Küchler is launching a surprise attack on some nearby base. Normally this is where the mission picks up in pace with a soft time limit. However, it's possible to just skip that, saving the player who does this the trouble of having to keep up with Küchler's advancing army. Now, the game developers did have this in mind, and had some measures which were in place to prevent the player from accessing certain areas of the map until they liberated this prisoner from his confines. But it's a bit incomplete, and you can still make your way into Küchler's base and level it before he even has a chance to start marching to his destination. It looks like Küchler himself shows up, along with a second force to wipe out that base for good. Look at him go. With this slightly buggy mission out of the way, the end of the story is in sight. The mission itself is quite nice, and you have an ally that can at least hold their own. Somewhat. There isn't much that happens here other than the British being defeated, and with that, Nathaniel returns home, with a lot less wealth than before, having spent it during the fort mission. This, along with him not being that great of a businessman, leads nicely into Emilia's story. A nice bit of continuity to tie things together, and to finish things off, we get a look at the next main character of this story, Chayton Black. And that's it. That's the first half. Overall, it was alright, much more bearable than previous stories. There were some missed opportunities, especially the line about the revolution being greater than one man. Despite that, the overall story is better with character decisions, and does a decent job of being connected with other stories. There's continuity, and it's neat. Speaking of connected with other stories, there is something that I'll bring up right now, and it's the fact that Emilia isn't doing the narration for the next part. It's Chayton. Well, actually, it was Emilia before the definitive edition rolled around. Why did she get replaced? Is this next story going to have altered plot points? What are ninjas doing in the West? We'll get to that once the next video is out. In the meantime, I guess I should do a proper outro this time, instead of just leaving. So, here it is. Thank you so much for making it this far into the series. I didn't anticipate video editing practice turning into the most viewed set of videos on my channel, but I guess that's what I deserve for making subpar content before. Anyways, if all goes well, I'll see you in a few months. Have a good one.